Drew, I'm really interested in this concept of mental fitness. Why don't you walk us through this term mental fitness and what it means?
Mental fitness is a new idea. It's an idea that we can do more for our mental health. And I think we all are looking for that right now. And I wanted to give people a framework based both on the research and my clinical experience working with patients for almost 25 years now. It's like, what do we do? And a lot of times mental health we think about as something we want to maybe avoid or not talk about, or we don't get into it until it's a crisis. And that's a horrible way to protect really your most important asset, your brain, your mental health. So mental fitness is about knowledge and new knowledge for a lot of people, which we'll be talking about, because we know a lot more about how your mental health works than ever before. But
Mm.
people often aren't using that in how they think about their choices. We need some new skills. I got to learn some stuff, and I had to learn to split board to achieve optimal mental fitness. I didn't know about that. I had to learn about lentils and about pesto. Everybody has some lessons about mental fitness that can increase really your capacity for what I think we're best at, Rupi. Creativity, loving, connecting, healing. That's when humans, I think, are feeling our best, doing our best. And then we need some new habits. Sorry, mental fitness.
Mm.
So knowledge, skills, habits, and all of this leads to a more enjoyable, more mentally sound life. Not that you're not going to
Mm.
have challenges with your mental health or tough things that happen to you, but you're going to go into those much better equipped, much more in some ways insulated. That's mental fitness.
Yeah. When I heard the term or read the term mental fitness for the first time in your book, Healing the Modern Brain, it kind of reminded me of my current exercise regime. So I was just sharing with you offline that I turned 40 this year, and it's top of mind for me to be in peak optimal condition right now because of the unfortunate but expected gradual deterioration in muscle quality and bulk and all the rest of it. And I want to be around for as long as possible for my boy, who's 10 months old now. And when I think about what I do in the gym, when I'm doing those reps, when I'm progressively overloading, what I'm doing is improving my resilience to what life will throw at me. And when I think about mental fitness, I'm like, okay, yeah, it's getting those reps in, it's creating a really strong foundation so that when we do have those inevitable ups and downs as a result of living, whether it's in a modern environment or a rural environment, we are more able to withstand those stresses.
That's exactly right. And we need more than muscle mass, as you know. And then
Yeah,
there's that way even for muscle mass. I think everyone listening, right? I bet you knew you had some ideas right away. If you wanted to start building more muscle mass right after this podcast, everybody knows a few things. You could do some
yeah,
push-ups, you could lift. When it comes to building our mental fitness, I found that a lot of us just have questions, or we run into feelings or ideas or ways that our minds work that we didn't expect, or it doesn't work sometimes. And so mental fitness is really to help both as we age, but also as we endure the different stages of life, not just endure, also try to thrive, right?
yeah,
The point of mental fitness is human life's amazing. Right? It can be filled with creativity and love and generativity, like the good stuff. But especially today, you have to work particularly hard and in a particular way. You have to
yeah,
incorporate more new science. You have to do some stuff. And if you don't, the research is quite clear what's going to happen to your mental health. And so that's, as you say, you're thinking about muscle mass, you're thinking about, how to be there physically for your son. But it probably for you as a dad, and what the research shows, the most important thing for you and your son is around your emotional health. Right? If
mm,
you're ripped at 52, 51 and a half, my age, but you're depressed, you're still drinking a lot, you're spending your weekends out on psychedelic journeys, or club or whatever, right?
mm,
Whatever version of middle-aged male life you could do. I don't think you're protecting his health. I don't think your longevity matters.
mm, yeah,
But I'm a psychiatrist, so I'm I'm about the feelings of the connection and the way that, especially for men with their sons, the way that is. I mean, there's really nothing like that for your mental health in terms of challenging it. in some ways. It's just really, you know, your fitness gets really optimal when you challenge it, when you sign up for that race, when you sign up for a new class, when you get into a new regimen. And I think it's the same is true for your mental fitness.
Yeah. Um, we've talked a lot before about food as medicine, nutritional psychiatry, of which you're one of the leading voices globally, I would say. Before we dive into that, because people have heard us talk about this on the podcast in the past, and I think it always deserves a refresher. I want to talk about some of the perhaps the more surprising elements of mental fitness that you talk about in your book that I'm personally really interested in at the moment. I mentioned I'm really trying to connect and think about the spiritual side of my journey, which sounds a little bit woo-woo, sounds a little bit out there, but actually I strongly believe in, and I think it's how we're wired as human beings. And you talk about this in your book. I wonder if we could start by talking about this concept of grounding. And people might have heard grounding from the machine that's been marketed to them on Instagram
Is
with
there a
these like
grounding machine now?
electronic.
Like you don't need the book. We've got it on Instagram. I don't know
Yeah,
about it.
yeah. It's like a mat that like you plug into an electric mains, and apparently it grounds you like that. That's what's being sold right now on Instagram. But obviously, your version of grounding is very different, and I think it's a lot more natural. So why don't you introduce this concept of grounding and how you see it?
Yeah, for sure, Rupi. And thanks for all the things you said prior. And everyone, if you're listening, if you're sensing Rupi and I know each other, I have a particular affection for Rupi. It's true. I remember you turning 30. I've known you that long. I remember you before the podcast, and
Yeah.
you're one of the men in my life where I've just taken such pleasure in watching you grow and create. And it's just been really, it's been a treat. It's taught me a lot about men and about friendships at a distance and about cheering for each other. So if everybody gets personal or get misty eyed, that's why.
Thank
Um,
you so much, man.
Man, it's just great to be with you, and I love seeing your successes. I think everybody listening does, and I don't think it's woo. I think all of us, everyone listening, there's something, especially as you're aging in your 30s and 40s and 50s, where you begin to think about that. If it's not a part of your life, you wonder what is that? What is going to be a part of your life in terms of as you
Mm,
think about bigger things and as you age. Um, so the spiritual side of this is very important. It's throughout the book. I think about this kind of psycho-spiritual journey that we're on of our own development. And I think the book is a request in a lot of ways for people to
mm,
make space for that. And it's very hard. It's one of the challenges. Um, Grounding and the idea of grounding in the book comes from my experience with nature. I wrote this book during a time, just as COVID came on board, I was finishing Eat to Beat Depression and Anxiety. And it was a really challenging time for all of us. It was a challenging time. I didn't plan to write that book during the pandemic. It was, um, and then after that, as we're kind of going through the pandemic, my family moves from our family farm, where kind of always have been in some ways a spiritual base to me, to the mountains of Wyoming,
mm,
and it's this huge shift in nature. And I've always been like a nature kid, even though I spent most of my career, early career in New York City. I trained at Columbia and stayed on as a faculty member there for about 20 years. And um, uh, and even in that urban environment, it was just so clear to me when I would go to Central Park, or when I would go upstate for a weekend, or in the sometimes we'd have a winter house in Vermont, and you just kind of go out in the nature, and something would change in your biology. I think we all feel that. And I think a lot
mm,
of us feel that in a spiritual way, something bigger, something deeper. It's like the nervous system picks up on a different language. Part of healing the modern brain is trying to share some of what I think, in very spiritual terms, is the science of this. That
yeah.
actually there is something going on. Your brain is picking up the trees in forests exude these molecules called phytosides. We breathe them in, and they change how our brain is firing and functioning. They shift how our immune system is regulated just a little bit. And so that letdown we feel, that kind of in some ways activation of that parasympathetic rest, digest, relax. So I find the forest quite interesting, Rupi, because there's all that, and then there's like when you hear the crack of a stick in the distance, and especially here where there are a lot of bears. I was on a
Mm.
paddleboard out in big nature just the other day, and we came across a moose, which is one of the more dangerous animals here, and her baby. And both like beautiful National Geographic moment, but that tension between
Mm.
safety and fight or flight is also part of what the grounding experience, what you don't get with the mat. It's part
Yeah.
of that experience of, can you return your nervous system back to safety in nature? Can you sit? Can you listen? And can you tune into all of your senses? So
Yeah.
grounding everyone is one of these 9 tenets. And I call
Mhm.
them tenets of mental fitness because I wanted something that all of us could agree upon in this in this era that we're in, where there's so much contention, there's so much marketing, there's so much that, like, I don't know, you don't know. We all agree things like sleep, nature, connecting, these are really fundamental. And so grounding is one of these tenets. It's later in the book, it's tenet 7, to try and honor one, nature is all around us. You can see you're here in my office, where there's my fancy psychiatry couch where I do the modern psychiatry work. Still have couches, and there's lots of plants in here. It's always been true for me of my office. I'm always trying to grow things, either in a greenhouse or on our farm when we had it. Just for me, it's a very fulfilling, very a magical place. The idea that little seeds become plants, become food.
Mm.
That's just all, and you add like sun and water and care. That's just always captivated me as an idea. And so grounding in Rupi, I'm curious your sort of experiences and what's been happening to you, what's been pulling you in. It sounds like fatherhood, but I think everybody's also very curious. How does grounding inform your mental fitness?
Yeah, I mean, I think me and my wife have had a practice where we put our phones away and we go for a walk. So this is even preceding us having a kid, and it's in those moments where I get a chance to relax. And I I'm not blessed to live really close to rural environments like the picturesque Natural Geographic um, moments that you just described there. But like, there's always a park, right? Even in most urbanized environments and cities, there's a park nearby, and ours was particularly lovely with trees and stuff. And I've always noticed that in those moments, I feel a lot calmer. You know, some people who are skeptically minded might just say, well, it's the absence of inputs. It's the absence of you being in front of a computer screen, which can be quite stress inducing. It's the absence of you bombarding your senses with a podcast or a newspaper article or whatever it might be. It's the absence of you, being glued to your phone if you're not taking your phone with you. And I think that's very true.
Kind of
But
true,
I
but it's
think it's
saying those are all sensory inputs, and it's not an
yeah.
absence of sensory input. I mean, it's a shift in sensory input, but on the phone, you're looking at things and hearing things and getting signals from your environment, and you're responding
Mm,
to them. It's
mm,
digital.
mm.
It's not in a lot of ways based in reality, in the sense that it's not specific to this time and place.
Yeah.
And not to push back, but the people who say like, oh, it's just the absence of those things. It's like, no, you're still getting sensory input. It's a shift in sensory input. I guess as a psychiatrist, how I'd think about it.
Yeah, totally. And a part of the book that I was really interested in reading about was and you're right. It's a differential input. It's a different sensory experience. And there was a part where you talked about how we're more acclimatized to green, or our eyes are actually designed by evolution to be more perceptive in green environments where we can pick out certain elements. I wonder if
Yeah,
you can expand on that.
there's lots of research about this, but I'll tell you, I learned it from a hospital CEO, Lisa Harris, who she was
Uh-huh.
building the new hospital in Indianapolis, Indiana, Eskenazi Hospital. And there were two features that we were doing an early tour. We're walking to the ER, and she stops, and we're in this kind of glass entranceway, and on either side there are garden beds. And she says these are going to be filled with trees and gardens. So even when you walk into the ER, the last thing you see before dealing with this chaos is nature. You see green. And she started telling me about this research that just seeing green, and it sounds like one of those things administrators say, except Lisa Harris is a physician. She's an incredible physician as well as being a hospital CEO. And so
Yeah.
also this hospital put a garden on their roof. which a lot of different hospitals are doing. They're kind of getting more green space, more natural space into the healing experience. And so green and seeing green and everyone, I challenge you to test this because, I read this research and I like to try things out. And I find for me, it's true that when I see more green and blue tones, when I see a natural setting, I find it's also when I see nonlinear things like a more organic shape, like the mountains,
Mm.
where, if there is a straight line, it kind of sticks out. Um,
Mm.
Something happens to my nervous system. And I think it's one of those parts of mental fitness that I like a lot, where it encourages us to experiment and try things in our own lives. And so
Mm.
just like Lisa Harris, Dr. Lisa Harris encouraged, hey, let's see how green affects things. Let's put more green in the hospital, see how it affects you. And everyone there noted. So another thing that hospital did, they got rid of the fires and they put this big kind of salad bar in, and they put a farmer's market at the hospital. And in the early days of this, the vegetable consumption of the hospital staff and the healthy eating just skyrocketed. This idea of just, you have the farm fresh food, you have the stressed out healthcare workers and the families who are dealing with lots of medical stuff. Let's put these together and try and create something that's a little more healing.
Mm.
Um, so grounding, nature, bringing in, whether you're in a hospital or an urban setting, whether you get out for a big walk. I really was inspired when I was living in New York by the people who, would just be pretty disciplined. They'd, hop on an early train, they'd pop upstate, they'd get dropped off at a trailhead. There are a variety of ways you can do this, or you can take the A train. I do this to surf sometimes. And it's wild to be like in your apartment and then, an hour and 15 minutes later in the ocean, like on a surfboard, like
Yeah.
in nature in a certain way. So it is all around you. You have to seek it out in some ways. And as you pointed out, it's a great time to get away from technology and the phone.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And there's also something else that I wanted to ask you about, looking at the research, more specifically about why these natural environments are so healing. And just to riff off that, I'm not a surfer, even though I really tried to be a surfer when I was living in Australia. I would go to this small secluded beach before my night shifts every time I was doing night shifts whilst I was working in A&E, in Sydney. It was a little beach called Delwood Beach, and I would go in there just before going to my night shifts, dip in the ocean. I'd feel super refreshed, and I'd get on the bus and I'd go and do my night shift. And it became sort of like a rite of passage, like a routine for me. And I remember speaking to my housemate at the time who wasn't medical, and it was like, the reason why you feel refreshed, dude, is because it's got like this energy and it's like, it's recharging you. And I was like, dude, it's probably just because the water's nice and refreshing and it's cool and it's just a way to wake me up. But then I read in your book about the latest research showing natural environments, including forests and beaches, fill the air with powerful molecules called negative ions. Negative ions are molecules with an abundance of electrons, hence the name, but they play a real positive role in brain health. Let's talk about negative ions, because when I've heard people talk to me about this, it's usually not scientists, it's usually not people such as yourselves. So I'm fascinated about ions and how this can play a role in my fitness, and how it did play a role in keeping me going during those grueling night shifts.
Yeah, I love that story about getting out into the ocean. And everyone, I wouldn't call myself a surfer. I paddle out as best I can and trying to get thrashed by the waves. I find it very invigorating. But I think that's a great example of, you're in a stressful and urban environment, right? Being a young doc, being on call, that is like really mentally fitness demanding. We
Mm,
see that because so many physicians burn out, right? We lose so many physicians to suicide and depression and addiction. So there's a way that you've got to institute stuff like this. And all of
mm,
you, whether you're a physician or not, you have moments like this or periods like this in your life when it's really hard to. It's much easier to kind of like, I don't know, scroll on Instagram and eat some chips and maybe have a soda because, you're going to be up late and you need some caffeine. It takes a choice. It pays off right away. And so part of what's going on is Rupi's hopping in, right? Is he's shifting his physiology. The other thing that I like about this, it's with food, I call it the food SIBO effect. It's like you make the avocado salad for yourself and you eat it at work and you feel amazing,
mm,
even before the
mm,
nutrients hit you, because you've done something for yourself. You've been in service of your health, and you know it. And I think we do respond to that. Negative ions. So everybody, if you've experienced this, you walk to the beach and you kind of get there at that like misty layer, and you get a little bit of a like, whoa, like cool
Mm.
feeling as you look out and contemplate our existence. Part of that is you're on the edge of something and you can't see the horizon. Part of that are these negative ions. They're when the water smashes up against, the wave and the surf, that misty stuff breaks up the water molecules. Also in the forest, you get a lot of negative ions, right? And so as you walk in the forest and you feel that shift, part of that is what we mentioned earlier, these phytosides. Part of that is also negative ions. There's actually a rumor in the Columbia Psychiatry Department. I don't know if this is true. I won't say his name, but there's a senior faculty member, and they're doing research on negative ions. And there's a lot of things that affect our mood, but this was one. And one of the senior faculty members said, "Oh, I'll try it out just to see how it is." And he got kind of like hypomanic, like a little high almost on the negative ions.
Wow.
He was like super
Wow.
like giddy and funny, and settled down afterwards. So they're one of the many things that have, a little effect on our mood. For some people, like this guy, maybe a big effect. Some of you are more compelled and feel like that edge of the beach more than others. But the idea behind mental fitness is encouraging you to explore these things. Some people don't like the beach, but they love the forest. Some people don't like the forest or the beach, right? But they love their backyard. And so there's all kinds of ways where you can get more grounding, more nature in your life. And I encourage another tenet is engagement. There's a
Mm.
difference between standing in your backyard grass with your shoes on and your shoes off. There just
Mm.
is. Try it. Little
Mm.
self experiment. There's a difference making pesto with basil you bought and a little basil that you grew. Basil's super easy to grow. It's easy to have homegrown pesto. Anyone can do it. And so again, maybe those aren't moves that you like. Maybe some of them you do, but mental fitness encourages us to build more of a framework in our lives that protects these core tenets. And in your time in nature is one of them. I think we can all agree. It's one of them that this delicious, I'm going to call it delicious modern life, tends to push out. It's easy to be very stimulated by the screen, to work from home, to not go outside much, to not have adventures in nature. And so, I hope people take this as a signal. It's funny, we're having this podcast now. Less than a week ago, like 5 days ago, I slept in a tent with our son, who's 11. So I'm about a decade older than Rupi, and our sons are about a decade apart. And
Yeah.
it's such a treat as you're understanding parenthood to start to travel with your kids, to get out into nature with your kids. Anybody who has kids, you get them out into nature, and they whoop and they holler and they jump on rocks, and you kind of see that like they fit there. They splash in the water, and it's just like, oh, this was like one of the early lessons in grounding for me. We'd been living in New York, and we couldn't figure out what to do exactly, and so we solved this in a strange way. We thought, why don't we move back to the farm, and I'll commute to New York from the farm in Indiana, which worked out for a little while. And so I got to experience these two settings, and I got to experience my kids and my dog in these two settings. It's an urban setting, and then this
Mm.
rural setting where they have 100 acres to race around, and that's what they do. I mean, it was just wild little experiment. So I'm
Yeah.
glad the grounding tenet appeals to you, and I hope everybody listening sees where mental fitness kind of comes in. It's one of these 9 things that the need for this book is that the modern world has taken some things away from us. It's taken healthy food away from us. It's taken good sleep. It's taken time in nature. It's really degraded the quality of our human relationships. And the more you push back on that, the more you reclaim these things that, again, are tenets. We all
Mm.
agree if you don't have them, you're not going to have good mental health. The more you reclaim those, I think the more you insulate and build your mental health.
Yeah, I think it's a lovely framework as well because people can look at these 9 tenets that you describe in the book and decide, okay, which area do I need to focus more on? And, the weighting is going to be different for each person in terms of the effect and what they choose to focus on, where they feel that they're lacking. And I think definitely grounding is one for me. And since having our child, I've noticed things as well, like, I mean, he's only 10 months, so he's like, crawling around and trying to stand and all the rest of it. So it's like chaos in our flat at the moment. But we have a little bit of green space. And I've noticed during the summer months, whenever he's in the green space and he's looking up at the trees, he's so much calmer. He's so much more in tuned. And I've been walking around on the grass like barefoot as well, just to sort of ground myself. And there's a lot of research looking at gardening and its impact on not just mental health, but physical health, cardiovascular health. And I've always ascribed it to the fact that we're getting people out and bending over and using their hands and exercising and the community element of it. But I'd like to think that as part of this multifactorial reason, there is a grounding element to it as well, where you're playing with the dirt and you're getting your hands involved and you're connecting with the soil. So yeah, no, it's wonderful to hear about that element of it. Um,
Ruby, that goes right into there are these three ideas I want everybody to look at these tenets. I call them lenses in the book. And you're
mm,
mentioning one of them where Ruby's entirely right. His negative ions, his nervous system settling down. There's more kind of stimulation. There's the green color. But the three kind of new ways we have to think about our mental health, particularly illnesses like anxiety and depression, is thinking about the microbiome, thinking about
mm,
inflammation, and then the third is thinking about neuroplasticity, which is the fact that our brains grow and change and repair themselves, and that those processes are really dependent on choices that we make every day. And so going out in nature is one of these tenets. And the tenets I try and connect through these three ideas, saying, hey, if you're going to think about depression, anxiety, and your mood and your cognitive health, right, really what's most important about our mental health, you have to know about neuroplasticity. You have to be thinking about growing new brain cells. You have to be thinking about what is all this new science about inflammation telling us about the brain. And so, Rupi, you're entirely right. A lot of that data about gardening, I've never thought it was the bending over because I'm just sore. I've probably, of psychiatrists, I'm going to be like top 10 in terms of amount of gardening I've done. Maybe that's not, but I'm guessing. I've done a lot of gardening and farming and tractor driving. So what I always thought it was being a feral creature in the dirt. And then I thought the spiritual part was putting seeds in the ground and getting food, as I mentioned
mm,
earlier. I think the new science tells us there's a lot going on in terms of the microbiome. There's a lot of data. Daphne Miller is a great family practice doctor in California. She wrote a book called The Pharmacy, which with an F, which
mm,
and part of that she talks about some of the research here in the United States and the Amish, but she looked at some research I think out of Germany of kids who were still on farms and had exposure to barns and farm chores, and just their inflammatory systems work differently. The way that they get triggered by things, they just have so much exposure that they have less asthma, they have lower autoimmune rates of autoimmune disorders. And so, part of it is the physical labor. I think part of it that I write about in the book is the natural sleep cycle.
mhm.
On a farm, you just don't sleep in. Some of the best working hours are those early morning hours because it's still cool. You can get so much done right away in the morning. If you have livestock, they need tended to. If you have crops, again, it's a nice time to be out there working. So, and by the end of the day, you're exhausted. On and boy, by the time the sun goes down, you hit the pillow and fall asleep right away.
Yeah, yeah. There's no need for any sleep optimization routines, I guess, when you're working that farm life.
It's really, I haven't gotten to experience a lot of it. I don't want to mislead people that I'm a huge farmer, but I got to experience enough of it, and certainly more than most people growing up really rurally,
Yeah.
where you just kind of you grew up in nature with the cycles, kind of out in the elements more. And then certainly as I spent more time in the farm later in life, it's funny, Rupi, but it's really after we had kids, I really had this like decade of urban existence. And then my wife and I started going back for the summers. And I remember there'd be this scramble in May. It's a little early to plant the garden in Indiana. You're still a little frost risk, but like I'd plant this huge garden in May and then go back to the city and we'd work for a month and then come back and try and get as much of the summer, especially with telemedicine. You could kind of spend more time gardening and farming, but really great for the mental health. I think also one of those places that one of the tenets, everyone is the tenet of unburdening, which is around thinking about trauma in modern terms.
Mm.
And thinking, probably sharing some of my experience as a psychiatrist of just hearing how embarrassed people are sometimes by things that stick with them. Maybe it was like a mean teacher and nothing, they just were mean to you, but it really shattered your self-esteem in some way that, again, people are sometimes embarrassed. Unburdening is really asking people to, when possible, because trauma is hard, to um, process and move through it in a way that liberates them more in their present life. And I find gardening and working in plants, I've had a lot of patients who just, they find a lot of solace there. It kind of keeps their hand busy and allows them to settle in and kind of process things. So I think gardening, time in nature, again, I really appreciate you picking up on these parts of the book, just because they illustrate, I think, for a lot of us, the need for it, the way that if you're not intentional, you can have a very inside sedentary life. And then
Yeah.
some of the science behind it, how, it's really wild to look at, like there are 6 or 7 now clinical trials of forest bathing to treat clinical depression. And you asked about the green earlier. I just remember this research. 5 of those are outdoor. They're like formal. You like this. I mean, this would help my depression, right? You go out into the woods and like play
Mm.
games, and then
Mm.
really like settle down. Let's like do a quiet walk and do sensing stuff. I mean, that would be great. But they also had 2 of them that were virtual reality. And I think about this
Oh,
sometimes, where
wow.
maybe some people don't have, certainly some people don't have easy access to nature. Can you get some of the advantages in VR? And apparently, according to the
Mm.
science, you can. So one of those great
That's
ways.
incredible. Finally, a use case for the Vision Pro, Apple goggles.
You just
You know?
get vertigo when you're my age. It's like you're just. I did like someone brought in, there's like a kayaking game,
Oh,
and I
yeah.
remember I felt the couch. Like my nervous
Yeah.
system was so. I'm like so old. I did for like the next 3 days. I was it was horrible. So,
I want to talk a bit more about inflammation, actually, as you just mentioned it earlier, because I'm fascinated by inflammation. I wrote about inflammation in pretty much all of my books, I would say. The last one, Healthy High Protein, had a chapter on inflammation, protein and fiber, or gut health. And I feel like I'm just scratching the surface, but I realize that it is absolutely connecting the diseases of modern living, whether it's cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative issues, psychiatric health, mental health. You know, it's just so foundational to so many issues, and the balance of inflammation is so important. So I'm curious to hear how you talk about inflammation with patients, how you link it to your own work, and what are your thoughts on inflammation and mental well-being.
I think the first point is that everybody in mental health should hear is that I look for it. And
Mm.
that's new. We didn't used to think about this or look at it in the same way. I look for it when patients are reporting their medical history to me, or if they're having things like rashes or inflammation, or in terms of like itching and skin things or bloating, or whether they have inflammatory diseases. I look for it in terms of, psychiatrically, in terms of what we call kind of activation or agitation, where people are presenting in a state where, they're really getting very disturbed by things. They're getting, and so inflammation is our body's alarm systems, everybody. I think we know that. And it's this big buzzword in medicine. And
Yeah.
essentially, the idea is that our modern life, the reason I call it healing the modern brain is that your modern brain, your brain has changed some, right? There's now microplastic, a teaspoon of microplastic in your brain. Right? There is now a whole host of foods with lots of, there are 40,000 new chemicals in the grocery store that is, considered safe, but, it's just like new stuff in your brain. And your brain is in this new modern context. And so inflammation, again, is our body's alarms. And the idea is that as our alarms are going off more and more, right, there's damage, right? If there was like 22 firefighters in this podcasting room with me, we'd be a little disturbed, right? They'd get hungry. They'd drink all my seltzers, right? They'd be on the couch. It'd be noisy. It would be hard to make a good. Ruby and I'd still make a podcast. We'd figure it out. but it'd be more challenging.
Mm.
And so that's kind of the idea that you want. I certainly want the firefighters here anytime they want to come by, but also when there's a fire.
Mm.
And so the idea is, are we triggering the body's alarm system? Now, since I'm in mental health, I really just mostly think about the brain and the gut. No offense to the other organ systems, but the brain has its own immune system. People kind of don't think about this. So, your brain can't respond to the alarms in the same way as the rest of your body. It can't swell. It can't create a bunch of pus. And so its immune system has to be different. Its immune system is paying attention, right? It's kind of got its antenna up and it's listening to the periphery, to the rest of the body. So if the rest of the body is a lot of inflammation, one of the things, some of the things that cause inflammation, we can see in our everyday lives. Poor sleep, and most people I meet, if we get into sleep quality, they're struggling in some way. I noticed that when I started monitoring my sleep. I'm one of those people like, I'm a great sleeper about like 7-8 hours. Not when you track it, like 5 hours and 18 minutes a night, doctor. It's like, oh, whoa. I was like, wow, that was a little bit of a wake up call of needing to do something. So poor sleep. A lot of people still smoke. A lot of people drink a lot of alcohol. Alcohol and lots of alcohol consumption is very normalized in our modern world. There's a lot of stress and chronic stress that people, just kind of in a vigilant, anxious state. People don't realize this. There's a lot of untreated mental health concerns.
Mm.
People don't kind of sometimes appreciate some of the antidepressants like Prozac are also anti-inflammatories. And so, so inflammation is again one of these. It is a big idea. When you say you feel like you're scratching the surface, like me too. And
Mm.
but I think as a farm boy and a psychiatrist, there's some ways I try to make this as a clinician really quite actionable. If inflammation is a problem, how do you know that you have problems with it? You can measure a C-reactive protein. You can get an ESR, not the most specific rate. You can also you got a lot of sniffles. Are there physical signs and symptoms that you've got some inflammation? Do you have really, really bad allergies? That's a good example. If you have bad allergies, what happens when your allergies? Do you feel great, optimistic, hopeful, energetic? No, you start to feel sad. You feel a little down. A lot of my patients, when they have allergies and they have that first attack, it really affects. They have a lot more anxiety. They have
Mm.
more mental health symptoms, and that's because these systems are really linked. And so, inflammation is one of the ways that mental fitness works. If we engage in mental fitness, and it is effective, which the science says it should be, and I believe it is, our levels of inflammation go down. We honor the sleep that we need and prioritize it, not just saying, oh yeah, I'll get 8 hours. Like creating your bedroom is a shrine to the most important 8 hours for your brain, which is when it cleans out all the garbage during sleep. And you don't want your garbage to back up in your home. You certainly don't want it to back up in your brain. And so these ways, going out in nature, eating the foods that, if you listen to Rupi's podcast, all the foods I'm going to tell you to eat too, and I'm going to tell you to eat Rupi's recipes because they're delicious. And I loved Healthy High Protein, by the way. I love your books, and I love you as a man who cooks and inspires us all. So, we can talk nutrition, but the foods that we recommend, I have my little rhyme: seafood, greens, nuts and beans, and a little dark chocolate is just places to start. I've added in, don't forget the rainbow celebration and the fermentation. It's not the best line, honestly, but I'm working on it. But
I
just
love
those are food categories, right? We want you eating more fermented foods and more lentils and more wild salmon and anchovies, right? These are and why? Well, part of that is it keeps us a healthy weight. Keeping a healthy weight is part of fighting inflammation. Part of that is those foods are the foods we've always eaten, and our bodies recognize them. And most of those are, if we think about a quote unquote anti-inflammatory diet, those are the foods that everybody recommends: more olive oil, more white beans. As we both talk about in our books, these foods have more nutrient density. This key principle of nutritional psychiatry. And in Eat to Beat Depression and Anxiety, I have this big illustration of inflammation of hey, here are all things contributing. So we can look at all of us, like me too, right? We look at it on the page and say, how am I doing? And really have that check-in that we need as a way to assess this aspect of our mental fitness. Are you living a lifestyle that, does what you can? to regulate inflammation. I think if you know any of my work, I'm really here to change your lifestyle, to change how you think about mental health in terms of how a lot of people want to battle inflammation is a first step, maybe lots of supplements or really, kind of specific, rigorous regimens. That's not. I'm really interested in the day to day, week to week, month to
Mm,
month. I know I'm going to recommend pesto this year, next year, and in 10 years because it's a combination of nuts, greens, olive oil, and garlic. I think that's good for you, and all the
mm,
science seems to say that's good for you. So, again, tenets. Things that I guess for everybody listening, and Rupi, I guess you too, as a 40-year-old doctor, here's a little mental health check in. The most important thing is the way that this affects your lunch, the way that this conversation affects you, over the weekend and on Monday, and how you really start to make different choices. Or for those of you who have this dialed in, I think there's another important thing, man, to really like honor it. A lot of
mm.
listening, the nutritional stuff. You've got it dialed in, right? You've kind of sifted through the information and know about inflammation. You're moving your body more than ever. You're drinking less than ever before. So, there are a lot of folks listening who, the main part of this conversation is affirming, that like you're doing it and it pays
Yeah,
huge dividends.
absolutely. I mean, I think I'm really curious actually to know a bit more about the wider aspects of inflammation lowering interventions that you might have come across, and not necessarily ones that you recommend, but ones that you're keeping your eye on. So I think, throughout your book and previous books, people can get a handle on how improving sleep can reduce inflammation, improving movement and regularity of movement, variety of movement,
Hmm.
food, big lever to pull when it comes to reducing inflammation, greens, nuts, good sources of omega-3. And now, we're just talking about grounding and being outside. I'm really fascinated by some other lesser known techniques of inflammation lowering that perhaps
Okay.
people wouldn't have come across.
I've got a
D-
few for you. I've got a few,
go,
Ruby.
yeah, you go for it.
All
I'll see
right.
if I can and add some if we don't align.
Number one, I get into this in the book, is the deep science of the dance party. This has been really lost in modern cultures. There's a lot of dancing, a lot of drunkenness, but there's not a lot of good dance parties anymore. If you look in the data around movement, exercise, and mood and depression, one of the most effective interventions is dancing. And often when in medicine, particularly, we recommend exercise, people, I think we mean like lifting weights and running, and that stuff's good for you, but a lot of people don't want to do that. I share a story in the book of a patient who I've been telling to exercise or asking to exercise for a long time and came in one day just totally glowing. And she'd been in a tango class, and I had no idea. Years ago, she'd done a lot of tango dancing and she'd gotten back into it. And it was, both it was great exercise. It was moving for hours, but also it was really good for social connections. It was really good for just being with other people. So in terms of inflammation, your question, like, what am I keeping my eye on? I'm keeping
Mm,
my eye on a few things. One is how connection and how deepening real human connections. A lot of people always say IRL, it has to be in real life. It's like, I don't know. I feel deeply connected to Rupi. I don't know him super well, but I follow his Instagram and I get to talk with him a few times a year, and we email and DM a little bit. It's a real human connection for both of us. And so the fostering and kind of nurturing those relationships greatly affects your inflammation. If you look
mm,
at people who are socially isolated, they have higher inflammatory factors. The risk of depression is just it goes up, and it's horrible as you get more and more socially isolated. We also see this as one of these feedback loops that happens. The reason I talk a lot about depression, everybody, is it's the most dangerous illness in terms of
mm,
you. If you look at what is most likely to take you out of your top form, right? What's most likely to cause disability, and what causes the most disability for our planet is clinical depression.
mm,
It causes the most disability, and that word's really important, right? We think about disability in some ways as physical handicaps and physical disabilities, and that's certainly true. But disability is really when we're not performing at our best for any reason. And so depression, substance abuse, those hit us earlier in life, and they take more years away than something like heart disease. And so one of the kind of foci of my work has been thinking about how do we really, how do you have 60, 70, 80 amazing years? Not how do you have 150. I think it's one of the ways that my interest in inflammation and neuroplasticity and regimens like this, uh, how to put it, it's longevity isn't of a lot of interest to me,
Mm.
because I'm really interested in the quality of the time you have here.
Yeah.
And what I see happening now is a lot of people are getting kind of seduced by the siren song of their mortality fears, and packaged up in a lot of different interesting programs, as opposed to addressing what's most important. I'll share with you something from my therapy, Rupi. It's a great interpretation my analyst gave me 2 months ago. And he's getting older. He's in his 80s now. And he chuckled and he said, "I think you need to bring death into everything." And I was sitting there putting my son to bed that night, and I was like chewing on that interpretation. I'm like, how do I bring death? Like, I was like, that's awful. And I hate this idea. Like, what is, I don't want to think about that now. And it really like brought me into the moment in a way that focusing our time and energy and money and efforts on getting longer and spending
Yeah.
more time here and using more of the earth resources for our own pleasure and our own will and own ego. I think the real value for everybody listening is in optimizing today
Mm.
and treating today like it's incredibly valuable. It's a day to take care of your brain, to take care of, most importantly, your human relationships. And so, that, and again, this idea of the disability adjusted life, this DALI, this notion of how do we reduce your disability? It's requesting in some ways you focus and pay attention to depression,
Mm.
right? The incidence of depression is pretty high. If you look at some of the statistics in America, like 1 in 4 women over the age of 60 are taking an antidepressant medication. And a lot of people see that and they say like, oh, that's like overprescribing. I don't know. Most women I know who are over the age of 60 are quite wise. They don't just do things, they do things that they know work. And so, there's been, there's been a lot of talk and a lot of debate about depression and mental health over the last, let's say, 5 or 10 years, especially online. There's been a lot of misinformation about psychiatric medications. There's currently a lot of attacks on all of that. And
Mm.
in some ways, with this book, Healing the Modern Brain, I wanted people to hear from a psychiatrist. I prescribe all those medications. I'm very grateful for them. I think that there's not a better time ever, ever in history to have a human brain, to have mental health problems. We know more about it. We have more resources. We have more treatments. We have more evidence than ever before. But I wanted also to put out something that we all agree on, that more and more people need to do to take care of their mental health that's lacking, to have a framework to kind of look at what you can do in an everyday life.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that focus on death. Actually, I think that's it's very stoic, and at first instance, when you hear that for the first time, it doesn't seem to make sense. But the more I focus on that personally, and I think everyone has to personalize it to their own circumstances, it makes me a lot more grateful. And gratitude is something that I keep with me all the time. And I think in the knowledge that this will cease to exist at some point in the future, hopefully not soon, but at some point, it does make you a lot more grounded in the present, and you become a lot more appreciative of everything. If, for example's sake, you would know that everything would end tomorrow. The raindrops on your face as you walk to the train station don't become annoying anymore. They become refreshing. They become a spectacle. The chatter that you hear when you're commuting that might be annoying because you can't listen to your podcast actually becomes immersive. It's just a complete reframing of your day to day, and it's something that I try and practice myself, and I kind of catch myself. I had this conversation with another psychiatrist, actually, you might know, Alok Kanodia. He's a healthy gamer online, and he talked
I,
about
I
every
know of him.
time.
He's like one of the psychiatrists that really like popped over the last few years, with his
Absolutely, yeah.
streaming, and just it's really wild to see some of these folks who are just reaching folks who like the gaming community, where there's so much talk and interest in mental health and so much need.
Totally.
So I don't know
Totally,
him
yeah.
yet, but I look forward to meeting him.
Yeah, yeah, he's a good guy. He's a reformed gamer himself, and he talks about when you meditate and you catch yourself like wandering, and you bring it back to yourself, and you're like, oh, it's a bad meditation. I'm gonna bring it back. That's actually the equivalent of doing a press up. That's the equivalent of doing a pull up. That's you
Mhm.
like reminding yourself of bringing yourself back to the present. So that's something actually that's a good thing. You caught yourself and you're bringing yourself into the moment or whatever you're concentrating on.
Yeah.
And I feel like, this practice of reminding yourself to be grateful is an equivalent, but one that you don't need to do with your eyes closed, cross-legged. It's actually something you do day to day.
Yeah, I talk about this in Healing the Modern Brain, around trying to kind of take these concepts that I find a lot of people in session initially are a little like they've tried it, or they're like little,
Mm,
you know, uh, or haven't thought about it. Things like breath work. Like for me, like I can go from, talking and assessing someone who's really struggling and having suicidal thoughts, and it's critical, to, 2 minutes later being in a session where someone's excited because their daughter's getting married, and I can't miss a beat. And so how do you do that? So one of the ways that you learn to do that is through your breath.
mm,
Another way that you learn to do that is really just as Luke is talking about, right? It's a process by which you're doing a rep. You get good at it by doing it a lot, by being intentional about it. But yeah, this idea of bringing back your attention. It's the same thing we notice when we read, right? All of us, especially those of you like me, maybe have a little dyslexia or just aren't as good at reading. Boy, you'll be at the end of that paragraph and be like, oh, what was that about? And you'll go back up, right? And that's the same thing where you're pulling your mind to really stay focused, stay on track. And
mm,
it is like a muscle that you can build, right? It is like anything, just like, if Rupi and I decided after this podcast, we're going to move to Japan and open a little restaurant together, live out our days there with our families, right? In 5 or 6 years, we'd be doing a podcast in Japanese. We'd learn to cook food. It would take a while, but our brains can do that. Just like that, your brain can learn to focus a bit more. The one I like is you mentioned earlier, where we turn kind of irritability into gratitude.
mm,
Not that we want to be Pollyanna-ish, that everything is great and we should always feel good, but that there's a notion that gratitude is always about giving thanks for the positive things. And in the book, I read a little bit about, gratitude is also giving thanks for our challenges.
mm,
That's a big part of parenthood, right? It's not always good. It's almost always hard and filled with some anxiety. It's filled with lots of wonderful moments and wonder too, but it's filled with a lot of learning. And so, having gratitude for that challenge, and for some of the challenges in our lives is a part of, I think, one of those reps as well. Again, that switching from irritated and
yeah,
frustrated into some gratitude that, you're up for the challenge. It's one of the
yeah.
great, most likely.
Which in itself is anti-inflammatory, which is where we started this little segue. You really threw me off with the dance parties. I love that. I recently went to an electronic dance music festival, so I'm glad that I was helping with my mental fitness whilst I was dancing
I mean, what did you think,
completely.
Ruby? How'd you feel that night? How'd you feel the next day? I mean,
Well, I felt pretty groggy, not because I was drinking or anything, because I was completely sober. But we got stuck leaving this festival in the north of England by the car park for 3.5 hours. And so I felt pretty horrible the day after. And so I have to almost like go back and have the same experience, but without the commuting issues
well, you got to
and the
leave a little
driving.
early. No, I think this is a good. These are some
I
of
have
the
to leave early.
powerful lessons of middle age I have for you. There's the footwear that needs to get more comfortable.
Yeah,
There's leaving a little early to beat the line so you're not up too late.
totally. Yeah.
Um, and I do think also with some of these, call them self experiments, it is important to sort of like find the gems, but understand that not everything's a gem. That we
Mm,
try things, we try foods we don't like, we try exercises classes, we try friendships. And they don't all work out or go the way we want. And
that's
it's
very
important to
true.
have that be a part of it, right? It's not that you're gonna drop everything, but that you're allowed to experience things and choose. I have this conversation a lot with people as they're starting relationships where they don't know. And I said, "Oh, sounds like you're figuring it out. Like that's okay. That's part of an early, like you have permission to not know for a
Yeah.
while about things, or at least you should have some to figure it out. Because when there's too much pressure to know, you're going to make the wrong conclusions. But
Yeah.
yeah, inflammation. I do have strange, recommendations. Dance parties for sure. That's one of them. I like the gardening and getting your
Mm.
hands in the dirt. We've talked about big nature, and that's a really important one for inflammation. Things I'm paying attention to, or at least wanting to learn more about, is how different dietary patterns are affecting inflammation. There's been a lot of interest recently in ketogenic diets in mental health.
Mm.
We're going to have actually a lot of data about that. There are a number of trials that are going to be reporting over the next 5 years, so we'll be able to make better evidence-based recommendations. There's been one pilot trial now that's really interesting for people with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. There's going to be interesting research in the microbiome, how we can shift the microbiome and how that affects inflammation. There was a great diet study out of Stanford looking at really eating more fermented foods being the major mover in terms of affecting the microbiome in a way that actually decreases some inflammatory markers and inflammation.
Mm.
That's exciting me. There have been more trials on mental fitness. There was a Calm trial, which is a trial that was in some ways very much what's happening for a lot of patients. People got encouragement around the kind of big lifestyle factors that we know: nutritional psychiatry, sleep hygiene, and exercise. And through this trial, it was delivered remotely. People showed equivalency to cognitive behavioral therapy, which is one of the gold standard
Wow.
psychotherapy treatments. So, again, what I think is really important is that we remember we're living in an era where there are a lot of treatments. A few of them certainly rise above the others in terms of the amount of evidence and the quality of evidence. And that increasingly lifestyle and lifestyle factors, especially for illnesses like depression, like everybody, we have
Mm.
number doctors use, or this metric number needed to treat. Like
Mm.
like how, if I've got this medicine, how many people do I need to give it to get one of them completely better?
Mm.
And so the number needed to treat for an SSRI antidepressant is like 7 to 9. I have to talk to 7 people or meet 7 people with depression to get one into full remission with something like Zoloft or Prozac. Maybe in the
Mhm.
hands of a experienced clinician or psychiatrist specialized in that, maybe that's a little higher. For transcranial magnetic stimulation, it's 6. That's like where we use magnets on the brain. For a diet, the SMILES trial, which Felice Jacquemin had a number needed to treat of 4.
Mm.
And then for
Wow.
exercise, the number needed to treat is 2.
Gosh.
And so, when you think about how we want to engage with patients around these illnesses, it's not that it's all exercise and food. I have lots of patients who really, bipolar illness is a great example. Gold standard treatment is definitely to be treated with medications to prevent mania and depression. Same thing, things like anorexia, like gold standard treatment involves treatment with antidepressants and atypical antipsychotics. It just, like, that's how patients get the best in terms of recovery. But there are these other pieces that we definitely want to emphasize. And actually, over the last and the time we've known each other, Rupi, the guidelines have changed. The WHO
Yeah.
guidelines have changed. APA guidelines have changed. Right? Exercise and nutrition are now included as primary steps in how we think about these illnesses.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm definitely watching the keto area with a lot of interest myself because I think for certain people, and I want to underline that for certain people, a ketogenic diet might be worth a try. I would always put that further down the line after something that me and you would align on in terms of a Mediterranean diet with lots of fiber and legumes and good quality fats. But the keto diet is very, very interesting. And another area which I'm not too sure if you've got much interest in is vagal nerve stimulation. So vagus, just for listeners, the vagus nerve is this long winding nerve. Starts around like the sort of horizontal plane of the bottom of your earlobes across your brain stem, and then sort of innervates multiple parts of your body below your neck, your heart, your lungs, your digestive tract, and just sort of like winds out everywhere. And they've found that vagal nerve stimulation with some FDA approved devices can significantly reduce inflammation. Now, I think the current use case at the moment is for things like rheumatoid arthritis, but as we've been talking, inflammation is so important to a number of different issues, including mental well-being, mental health. It stands to reason that it might have an impact. And there's ways in which you can stimulate your vagus nerve right now, through breathing, exercises, being more grounded, etc., meditation.
I like
But
humming. I like humming.
yeah,
And
yeah, humming,
singing.
yeah, yeah.
Singing is probably my favorite. Everybody, I think, when singing more in your life is good for your mental health and good for your vagus nerve.
There you go. Yeah, singing. I mean, I don't want anyone to be around me when I'm singing for
Really,
their own mental
that's
health.
a horrible thing to say. You should definitely want people around you when you're singing. Who are you going to harmonize with?
I know, you
Who
should
are you
ask
going to
my
belt it
wife
out
for
with?
that.
Oh my gosh! All right, we're definitely singing next time. I like the vagus nerve is really interesting. Vagus nerve stimulation is also kind of in the when we think about depression that doesn't respond to multiple treatments that like antidepressants, psychotherapy. Vagus nerve stimulation is kind of in the treatment plan. Sometimes it's not used a
Mm,
lot. I think the vagus nerve and using the idea of the vagus nerve is really important in terms of how we think about our nervous system and our mental health. Right, building these skills, and some of them are vagus nerve skills. I just led a workshop with a woman who created a vagus nerve deck. And there are all these interesting exercises she has about kind of engaging with your vagus nerve. Melissa Romano, and she reminded me that I'd forgotten the vagus nerve is the largest of our 12 cranial nerves, and as you're mentioning, it sort of senses everything down below. It's also the major way the microbiome communicates with the brain, right? People, you often hear this fact, and it's kind of presented in a misinformation way that most of the serotonin in your body is in your gut. And that's
mm,
factually true. It doesn't have much to do with the serotonin in your brain. There's separate pools. There are about 500,000 serotonin neurons in the brain. There's not a lot of them. But the way that serotonin and these other neurotransmitters in the gut do communicate with the brain is via the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is kind of hanging down and sensing the gut. And one of the ways that the gut communicates is via the organisms in the gut that
mm.
digest fiber and create things. They create things like short chain fatty acids that feed the inner lining of our colon. Those short chain fatty acids are also signaling molecules that increase the tight junctions between the lining of our colon, which is a good thing. And so the vagus nerve is, right away, right? When we say we feel it in our gut, or when you get nervous, right? The place you feel it is in your gut. That's vagus nerve phenomena, right?
Mm,
That's how your brain is sensing the gut, sensing what's happening. Also, as I often point out, we all have the experience of how good our brain is at sensing the gut when you eat something that's off. You get just a little bit of food poisoning. You often know for about 30 minutes, maybe 45 minutes beforehand, that you're going to be sick. Right? You kind of sense it a little bit. It feels a little strange, and so this is all around the very primal function we've had of being able to sense what we eat and use that information. It's obviously always been key for our survival. I think manipulating the vagus nerve, so I've had some arrhythmias in my life, and the first thing I'll do is go up and start humming,
yeah.
rubbing my vagus nerve, which is right here, and then bearing down. Like you're
Mm,
needing to go to the bathroom, and that increasing the intrathoracic pressure, the vibration, and then the massage are the three ways that I think we can get a little more stimulation of the vagus nerve. Vagus nerve, people have also heard about it in terms of it kind of triggers what the parasympathetic part of our nervous system, which is the rest and digest.
yeah.
And I like to put in there, it's not just rest and digest, right? It's rest, digest, and connect. Because really, until you're settled down, take that breath, right? Focus, work that muscle of being really present. And you can't really connect with people. And so I like thinking about our parasympathetic nervous system is not just for this, oh, it's fight or flight or it's rest and digest, but it's also, it's in the state where we can be connecting, we can be creative, right? We can be more meditative and thoughtful. And so it's in some ways the state we want to get into as much as possible. And I hope mental fitness, I don't talk too much explicitly about the vagus nerve, but in some ways that's really what I'm after, is for people to be in this more kind of regulated, uh, um, uh, mentally empowered state.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because the more I have stressors in my life, a baby, obviously I'm trying to reframe that. It's a very, very positive thing to experience. And, every day I'm grateful for it, but it's stressful. And running a business and doing all this other stuff with the podcast and the Doctor's Kitchen app and all the rest of it. The more I'm leaning on the sort of the extra sort of characters there are, these extra tenants, if you like, of mental fitness. I think I've got my diet dialed in, sleep as best as I can, movement. But things like grounding, extra anti-inflammatory activities, whether it be dancing or extra unintentional movement, and even things like supplements. I mean, I'm not a massive fan of supplements, but I do take omega-3 fish oil. I think there's enough evidence for me from a cardiovascular point of view to recommend that and take that myself. And I'm exploring other things like broccoli sprouts and moringa, some powerful anti-inflammatory ingredients that I incorporate as a supplement to a diet that's already pretty good as a baseline. And I always recommend people think about it that way. Are there any others that you think of, or in terms of those extra additions to harmonize inflammation from a supplemental form, or any medications or pharmaceuticals that you think we should be keeping an eye on as well?
I mean, I think everybody's interested in the way that the GLP-1 medications are affecting
Yeah.
inflammation. I think that, there's been a lot of controversy about things like turmeric in terms of, I think the American Society of Medicinal Chemistry issued a statement saying there have been 1,000 human trials and none of them are positive. There have also been a lot of people who have had benefits. I think in terms of what you just mentioned, and not from a supplement or medication standpoint, although there's lots of cool stuff coming out about that. But for you as a man in your 40s, I think that the final tenet 9, which is the
Mm,
tenet of purpose,
mm,
is everybody, as you heard Rupi go through all these things that are super important, and at the same time, it's a lot to keep in the air at the same time, being a clinician, being a father, being a husband, engaging in self-care, running an app, running a podcast, having other bit, right? It gets to be a lot of things. And so your sense of purpose, which, as we all hear in this podcast for you, the thing that comes up the most is your son
mm,
in the powerful way. And so your sense of purpose is really shifting. You've been leading and inspiring lots of people, and that will continue. But there's something else that's opened up for you, which is around fatherhood, which is around being a man in your 40s, and how your purpose shifts. I'm probably particularly keen on this, having just turned 50. I don't know, something happens, something very powerful happens. Um, and so for you, that sense of purpose and sitting with that, it's a very short chapter, everyone. And I think all of you can look in your lives wherever you are and think about the way that our purpose and our sense of purpose has shifted from those angsty days in our 20s when we probably shouldn't be being asked too much about our passion and our purpose, but we should be living and exploring and building
mm,
skills, to the 30s and 40s, where you're engaging in it and seeking it, and to your 50s, 60s, and 70s, where hopefully you're relishing in some sense of how you've understood that for yourself. Purpose is a very personal thing. In the book, I really encourage people not to think in such grandiose terms. Not that you can't change the whole world. I mean, Rupi is right, but some of us, some of us maybe, are going to have a different type of influence. There's all kinds of ways that we find purpose, and I think it's one of those parts of the modern world that's been pulled away from us. That used to be, in some ways, much. There were more clear tracks in front of us on how we
mm,
found purpose, whether that was. Through our institutions or churches, or through patriotism. Lots of those still exist, but I think in the modern world, things have really shifted for people. And so, thinking about your purpose and how you pursue that, and how that, as I note in the book, we've all had those days, like when you wake up with a sense of purpose, right? You've got to be somewhere, you've got something really important to do, it's, and I mean, you don't need an alarm. You set out your clothes the night before, right? You run over the interview in your head. I was doing that a little bit before. I was a little, I don't know, a little, I've been given an interview and just a little bit, I was kind of going through my routine. I found my sound bites, right? I was really purposeful this morning. Now, I made sure I didn't have too much coffee. I tried to make sure, I don't want to be too personal, but some personal. I want to make sure, all the stuff. And so having a sense of purpose, right? Why? Because if you're still with us, I wanted you to get a sense of inspiration and hope. But I also, you hear that kind of almost drill sergeant part of me. It's like, I want to hear about your mental fitness progress. I want a serious revamp. I want to hear about amazing sleep. I want to hear about incredible nutrient density. Let's share, please. How do you just really deepen your connections with the most important people in your life last week? And how are you going to do it next week? And not in a burdensome way,
Mm.
but much more in a way that I hope is encouraging because of the benefits of that to you. That it feels great. It feels great when we sleep well, when we eat well, when we move our bodies and dance, when we connect with our friends and families and loved ones. So, um, that's what I hope people are taking from healing the modern brain.
Yeah, absolutely. Drew, honestly, you're fab. I love your books. I love this book in particular. It's a great read, and I think there's so many actionable tips and certainly things that I've taken away from it as well that I wasn't fully expecting. But I'm glad. I'm really glad that you've written this for as many people, and it's really interesting to see how you surfed the last 10 plus years that you've been in the public eye, and how much psychiatry has changed, and being at the forefront in nutritional psychiatry and then incorporating all these other sort of elements of lifestyle medicine into your practice is it's brilliant. So I appreciate you, man.
Well, thank you. As I say in the beginning, the book's dedicated to my patients
Mm,
because I really feel without them, and I don't know how many tens of thousands of clinical hours I've just gotten to sit listening to people on that couch a lot. And when you do that, it holds you accountable. It holds you accountable to be reasonable and not hyperbolic and not
mm,
overpromise and underdeliver, but also to really pay attention. People walk in and they're really, really in bad spot when they met you, and now they're feeling great, and they're
mm,
engaged in a relationship, and you really want to pay close attention. Like, what happened? What did they do? What did we say? What did we discover? Was it a medicine? Was it an interpretation? And so again, that's where these tenets come from. I think are really lessons that I learned from my patients. That no matter where you are in your mental health journey, human connections always feel good.
yeah.
No matter where you are, having a sense, being able to hold on to like your sense of purpose, or we didn't talk much about the first tenet, self awareness, right?
Mm,
Which is painful. Like self awareness is hard, right? We sit because we got to sit and do the thing that's often hard for people, which is really accepting and honoring what we're good at, and the ways we're in the world that we like, and then looking at our challenges and just being honest about that. Some of the things that we struggle with we're going to struggle with. There are things about ourselves that we can change, and other things sometimes we don't. And so self awareness and is so key to this whole process. So I just wanted to slide it in there at the end. It's something that as a therapist I'm always working on in myself and in my patients. How can we come into this really knowing as much as possible about ourselves?
If you loved that episode, you will love the full library of podcasts from the Doctor's Kitchen Library. We talk about everything from inflammation, supplements, and food as medicine. Just like this episode right here. You can click it right now and check it out.